Welcome to the World Wild podcast. I'm Miles Irving, and I am going to quite figuratively introduce a new thread into the World Wild conversations today. I say that because we're going to be talking about nettle fibre and, in fact, nettle fabric. But it gives me an excuse to do this kind of wordplay thing, which, in a way, I'm not even sure it is wordplay. I think it's quite serious business to be weaving threads of meaning into fabric of meaning and culture, which comes in quite an important way as part of what connects us to land and biological processes or other species. Because as I've mentioned before, I think there is a concern about using the language of mechanisms to frame our world and to discuss our ideas. For example, I'm reading a book about the gut flora at the moment. It's called the gut brain something. The point is that in this book, there's a lot of use of computer metaphors to describe what's going on. And I actually think it's unhelpful because it makes us frame things in mechanical ways with all the attendant problems with that. The machines are closed systems. Machines involve linear cause and effect. And machines don't have soft surfaces with semi-permeable membranes. These are all things. I think I will do a particular conversation based around in entirely this subject at some point. But on the other hand, just to touch on it briefly now, I think that when we start using metaphors and images from the biological world, from this living organic world, which is full of soft surfaces and exchanges passing through soft membranes, so that it's very difficult to see where one thing starts and another ends. And we have the pattern of, just the complex patterns, the circular causality, and this kind of exchange, which constitutes a form of union between one species and another, one organism and another. I think when we start thinking in these ways, we're actually being true to ourselves rather than alienating ourselves. And also, I feel that this is a way in which we begin to enter this kind of animist space where we see the whole world as living and having the qualities of, relational qualities that we have relationship with every other living thing. When we talk in these ways, we're bringing that realization into our daily consciousness. And so we're opening up a space to be more biological, to be more ecological, to be more reciprocal, since reciprocity is the actual quality and characteristic of organic life. Whereas, when we think in terms of mechanical metaphors, we are talking in terms of hard boundaries. And also, very importantly, a lack of personhood, because reciprocity can only happen between living things, which I'm increasingly thinking there's an integral sense of personhood about the nature of living. Personhood and being are fairly closely woven together. Okay, well, I wouldn't say I couldn't resist. I didn't want to resist the opportunity to elaborate a bit more on that kind of metaphorical space. And so we have a wonderful conversation this week all about nettle fibre. And I'm talking to Gillian, Edom, who seems to be very authoritative in the field of the history of nettle fibre and some of the technicalities of the process. And Gillian actually got in touch very recently to point out a mistake on one of the blogs I've written where I mentioned nettle fibre and said something that wasn't true. And that's led to this conversation. And yeah, I won't say more about that because we go into it in some depth in the course of the podcast. But suffice it to say, this subject of fibre and fabric from wild things does just begin to open up the space to be more, to have more breadth of coverage with regard to the use of wild resources and the potential for the use of wild resources and how we can begin to weave culture that integrates people who live in a place with their surroundings because they find another thing that they have daily use of, and obviously we have daily use of clothes, especially in our current climate. That's a necessity, and there's an opportunity for something to develop around this nettle fibre. As you'll see, that's part of the discussion that you're going to hear, and I will be looking at other topics around this, like other kinds of weaving, for example, like basket making has a lot of different materials that could be gathered from the wild and utilized. I think that's a subject we need to also explore a bit more, having touched upon it previously with Anna Lewington. And there are a lot of other subjects we could be covering with regard to utilization of wild plants that we can find in our immediate surroundings. Okay, so I think that's enough by way of introduction, and we'll get on with the conversation with Gillian now. Of course, this conversation all goes back to you emailing me last week and pointing out an error on my website.
And, actually, you must realise that I don't normally, but I see so many things. I think, oh, here we go again, and I don't bother. I just ignore them. But I thought, no, this person is writing about really sensible things, and you're obviously very knowledgeable. And I just thought, oh, I'll just mention that, because people have done it to me, and I haven't minded, because it's not being malicious. It's just sort of adjusting something, because it is a huge assumption that people make about nettle fibre, and there's nothing really in literature to challenge that.
Yeah, well, I obviously, when at the time of writing, I said, I think what you pointed out that I'd said was that nettles used to be the major fibre crop in Europe. That I can only think I must have been labouring under that illusion at the time, and I wrote it down. But it's clearly, I think I'm better informed now, and I wouldn't make that statement now. But I'm very glad you pointed it out, because I mean, we're all guilty of talking nonsense at times.
Well, I wasn't actually saying that you were talking nonsense.
But I clearly was. And and I think I'm really interested in the whole thing around expertise and so on. Because I don't actually believe in experts. I just believe in everybody still learning. Whoever that. And a friend. Well, no, not really a friend, but this bloke I used to kind of listen to his talks and that. He once said, when we look back, 5 years ago, we realised what idiots we were. He said the trick would be to know that we're idiots now. So, and then we could have that level of openness that would probably we'd learn more now if we
maybe we need to assume that we're idiots, and then work on that basis.
But the thing is, obviously, what we all need is to talk to people who know more about things than we do. So the great thing for me about looking forward to this conversation is knowing that you know a lot more about nettle fibre than I do, because I think it's such a fascinating subject, and also I'm so excited at the prospect of having been wrong about nettle fibre being a major crop in the past. I've nevertheless been dreaming about it becoming a major crop in the future, which maybe this whole, I mean, you've pointed out to me this Facebook group which I've joined, or just asked to join, where people are, and it looks very vibrant, people discussing nettle fibre, and it looks like maybe it's true that it's the opposite is true, that there's more interest in nettle fibre now than there has ever been. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there has been continual interest in nettle fibre. It raises its head continuously over the last however many years. The Facebook group has made something possible that's not been possible in the past, is for individual people who have been interested in nettle fibre to communicate with one another. So when I started my research more than 20 years ago, this was before social media, and it was in the early days of internet. So I spent a lot of time trying to make contact with people who had any knowledge at all of nettles or nettle fibre. And I wrote so many letters, and then I wrote emails. So lots of people weren't accessible by email then. This is not that long ago, really. And so I used to spend a lot of time writing letters, ringing people up, trying to track people down to ask them. That could happen in 5 minutes now. And not only that, is that even the concept that fibre could be made from nettles has got more widely distributed, so people wouldn't even have heard of it before. Now it comes right before them and they pick up on it. So there is this worldwide gathering together of information and people who are all beavering away, as you'll see, trying to achieve it.
Well, I just wondered because we've just exchanged a couple of emails, so this is I don't even know what do you do for a living, what's your background, and how does that all fit into your
me? I don't really know to start with that. So at the moment, my work is mostly as an oral historian. Okay. So I work mostly on Heritage Lottery Fund projects. In the past, well, I originally trained to be a
Could you tell
teacher.
me more about what you do as an oral historian? That sounds fascinating.
Okay, well, apart from working with volunteers sometimes and organising them and training them and organising them, the best bit is to actually go out and interview people. So I don't know if you know about Heritage Lottery Fund projects. Normally they're trying to find out some heritage aspect of a place or something that's happened. So, for example, the most recent one I'm working on is a church in Chichester, and they are having a new building work, and as part of their funding they have to have a heritage element to that. So they're collecting people's stories about the various things that happened over, in living memory. The last one I did was about Selsey fishermen, and I've worked on a mental health project and a woodland project, archaeology. So there's all sorts of things. So what you do is you go along and you interview people and just basically ask them what their experiences and their opinions are. So it's not like an interview on television or the radio. It's not like a newspaper interview. You're giving them the opportunity to have a voice. And although you obviously want them to provide information for the project, it's an opportunity for them to actually talk about what they know personally without being constrained or not too constrained. And that way you discover a whole new world. You become a little mini expert in something because you've sat and listened to all these different people who have had different experiences and even different perspectives, so completely polarizing positions on something. Someone will say this, so they may be actively, for example, in the fishing project, you'd have a fisherman who are finding a lot of constraints by the authorities, and then you'd interview someone from the authorities to explain why those constraints are necessary. So you get opposite points of view and that sort of thing, and because people don't feel threatened, they don't feel that everything is going to be out there. Whatever they say, they have control over the what happens to that interview. So if they say, I don't want you to use that bit, then you don't use that bit. But you don't actually put the whole thing out there. When you're using it in a project, you take elements of that interview and you use them to tell the story, the bigger story.
But what is the final output from that? Where do the interviews end up?
Oh, the interviews normally end up, if there's an organisation who've commissioned the project, then they will keep copies, but they always end up in the county record office. So they become a research tool for the future, and they're looked after there. They're protected, all their copyrights protected and permissions and things like that. But in the project, what you would have some exhibition or a book or something like that going on, and then you'd use those interviews and take parts of them that were suitable. You don't use the tricky stuff. There's no point, unless it's relevant, of course. But you take that and build a story for people to come and actually listen to or to read about, and then and you've got real people saying things. So that's how it normally works. But it's interesting.
It sounds fascinating. I think that there's a project that happened near here which I don't know if it was oral history as such, but I reckon it must have been Heritage Lottery funded. Some of the ladies in the village spent however long going around talking to people to get the old field names.
Oh, really good. Yeah.
And the output from that was we've got a great big map now. So I'm based in a village called Charlton. At least that's where the business is based. Where I'm sitting now. And just up the road in the village hall, there's a massive map on the wall of Charlton, and all the old field names that are on there. And it's so some of the fields are built on now, but still they're still marked out in the old form of the field with the field name. And I can tell you a lovely story actually. There's one of the field names which is mostly built on now. Their house is next to a river, and the field name is Dabchick, which I don't know if you know your birds, but Dabchick is another name for the little grebe. Well, this field, which is now mostly houses, as I say, it's right next to the river, and it's actually right next to where the road crosses the river. So you can stand on the bridge next to the river, looking at what used to be the Dabchick field, and guess what? I wouldn't say 9 times out of 10, but maybe 3 times out of 10, when you stand on that bridge, you will see a little grebe. So you know that that's why the field was called that. And it's the only place that I reliably see little grebes along that river, even though they must be there, but it's where they seem to most like to be.
Yeah.
So anyway, it just makes me think that I didn't know how that project got funded, but it's quite likely that it was a heritage one. It sounds a great thing that there's money going into people exploring I guess the living local history in that way.
Yeah, it is. There's some really good results sometimes, and there's also all sort of social impacts as well. You know, when people who get involved, and so when I was working on what's the Grainingwell project, which was to do with the closure of the local mental hospital and the impact that had, and that was fascinating as well. But there was one of the main aims for that project was to reduce the stigma around mental health. And it certainly did that, and it really caused people to think and to engage, actually. So that was really worthwhile. But, you know, the thing is that what I did in these projects, all these people I talked to, this knowledge that I sort of acquired, it keeps coming back. So it keeps coming back into my life and into my head and becoming still relevant to all sorts of other things as well. You know? So it's quite a good job, hard work.
Yeah, well, stories are like that. I know they're a tapestry. Yeah. Every story is another thread, and it all weaves into the meta story that we have as individuals, and then the other meta story that we have as collectively. It's funny. I can't resist saying, you talking about closure of mental hospital. That's another local story here. We had a big, they called it an asylum back then, called St. Augustine's up on the hill. And there's people still alive now that remember they used to let the inmates out to walk around the village, but they'd be chained together. They'd have manacles around their ankles, and they'd be chained together so they couldn't run away. It's extraordinary to think that within living memory that kind of stuff was happening in the village. So how do we get from oral history to your involvement with nettle fibre and fabric? Assuming that there's a link between your interest in that kind of history with your interest in the nettle history. It is
not at all.
Oh, okay.
No, it's just these are accidents of my life.
Yeah.
Most of the things that I've done, got involved with, are sort of natural things to have happened at the time, but I haven't sought them out. You know, they've happened to me, and I've followed a path and ended up getting lost, literally. And so, you know, the oral history started because I got work on a project in West Sussex Record Office, and that led from one thing to another, and you know, that's many years ago. And so I've ended up doing this as a freelancer. The Nettle thing was probably from birth, but we won't go that far. That's a long time ago. So there's this I've had this natural interest in plants,
Yeah.
Now I don't know where that came from because the rest of my family aren't the same, but I had this thing about plants and also compost heaps, and so I, you know how you sort of learn as a child, you become aware of something and then you keep looking at it and thinking about it, and no one tells you actually you can get interested in that and you can do something with it. So I had to find it out myself. But nettles. So nettles, I'm just trying to think. When I had children at home and I stayed home to look after them, I had a large number. And but as I really wanted to do that, I loved it.
How many kids did you have?
I've only got 4. um, there were times, when it seemed quite a lot. So that was a long time ago, and I used to get. This is before Google, by the way. So I'd go to the library and I would borrow all these books about plants and nutrition and anything that I was interested at the time, but frequently plants and herbs. And I do remember having this one book, which was about herbs. And now I know that what the man was writing about was complete rubbish, actually, because I found out the truth. But he put these things in about nettles, and I thought, oh, this is really interesting. This is really interesting. And then I started to try and find out more about nettles, and I discovered actually that no one's written a book about nettles. So I thought, I mulled that over for some time. And at the same time, I was also interested in textiles, and I'd acquired a spindle and some fleece, and I'd started to spin in between feeding children and cleaning up after them and that sort of thing. But I didn't do this in a big way. It was just all very experimental. Yeah. And I do remember the one on the occasion that I decided to write this book about nettles, and it was one of my daughter's birthday trips. She must have been about 11 or 12, and it was just before Christmas. And I took her and her friends swimming, and I sat on this little table watching them writing a Christmas letter. And it's so vivid. And I wrote in this letter, I'm going to write a book about nettles. Now, where did that come from? And then it was like I'd committed myself then and written it down. So off I went, and I started, and I started badly because I just went and looked in books and wrote down everything that it said, and so my whole research journey was a learning experience as well, and all the time I suddenly I'd get really overwhelmed. I think, I feel, no, this is terrible. I can't do this. It's too overwhelming. And then I'd think, well, I don't have to do it today. And in fact, no one knows about it, so no one's going to hold me to account really, apart from what I'd written in that letter. So it went on, and then I began to get deeper and deeper, and then I discovered, actually, in order to really write this book, I'm going to need to be a botanist, a biologist, chemist, a doctor,
social history.
All these things I needed to know about all these things in depth, and it was really, this is where it was going. And then I came across another man who was writing a book on nettles. So I thought, oh no, this is interesting. So I rang him and had a chat. I think he was a bit nervous. But anyway, I rang him and had a chat. And what I did discover is that the area that I had probably had the most interest in, he had not gone into in the same level of depth, and that was the nettle fibre. And I was finding myself by this time really being pulled in. And, I was ordering like all these research papers and anything that I could find. I was going on these journeys to meet people who were involved in nettle fibre. It was like this thing that got bigger and bigger. And and also one of the most important places I went was Kew. Actually, I made friends with someone who was really, really helpful, gave me lots of information, and she actually got me. She worked in the Centre for Economic Botany in Kew, and she got me a pass to get in the building.
Who was it?
Her name's Laura Hastings, and do you know Laura? She's.
I've had some correspondence with her. I haven't met her. I thought it might be. Oh, there was a guy, Hugh Prendergast, and a lady.
Oh yes, I knew Hugh. Yeah.
Oh, I can't think of her name is, but they wrote a book about wild harvest, things that could be used.
I've got it here actually.
Yes. So that could put me out of my misery. Well,
It's Helen Sanderson.
yeah, so Helen
Yeah,
Sanderson.
I
She's the
remember
one I
her.
actually spend a lot of time interacting with, so it's no excuse for forgetting her name. But anyway, yeah, yeah. So
Yeah,
the Centre for Economic Botany I'm familiar with. They're all about this kind of plant use thing, basically, aren't they?
yeah, and so they've got an archive in there, and I spent hours, days going through all the documentation about nettles, and that is where I got my real source information about the history. So at the same time that I was doing this research, I was also experimenting. So anything I read about nettle fibre extraction, I would go through that process of trying it. So I had to do it with clogs. I had some leather clogs, and I had to do it, and I had nettles in the bath. People couldn't have baths in the house, but we had a shower as well, so that
So
was all right.
were the kids still at home at this point?
Oh yeah, they can tell you
Oh,
stories.
madness! I love it.
And I had
We're
never.
on the journey, whether they liked it or not.
Well, actually, my older daughter, just recently, she said to me, "Oh, we had a half landing going up the stairs, and I'd managed to acquire from Hamburg Botanical Institute some Girardinia diversifolia, so that's a Nepalese nettle,
Oh, I have a friend that's
seeds.
that. I mentioned the Kilbrides because I confused
Yeah.
you
Mm.
with the other Nettle lady. Um, well, Thomas did a research project on that Nepalese nettle. So
Oh
that's
right. Yeah. Well,
anyway.
I managed to I managed to germinate these
Yeah,
plants,
yeah.
and I had one on the landing. It was quite big. No, really ferocious stingers. Really, I mean, you think that we've got bad ones, but this is a really big stinger, and it used to be.
You very kindly left it on the landing.
Yeah,
As-
and my daughter said actually every time she went past, she got stung by this. Well, the thing is, it got quite big, and what I knew it needed.
just stop going upstairs when it got quite big.
Well, they were very patient, really. I mean, they probably, I'm sure they moaned, but you don't take any notice of children moaning, do you? Anyway, so I decided that what I needed to do was to find a tropical greenhouse for it to go in, to be looked after. So I managed to find one in Pulborough, which was quite some way away. And I contacted this person and said, I've got this nettle, would you mind looking after it? And so he took this nettle in, and then I went back to visit it once, and it was like a triffid. He was really proud of it. It was absolutely massive. And do you know, I've never been back since. And having taken over the whole of this greenhouse, but he was had commercial greenhouses, but he looked after this nettle, and it was amazing. I feel bad that I haven't been back, but I couldn't fit it in. It was just too much. So anyway, that was just one of the things. But anyway, yeah. So nettles did rather creep into the house in many forms, and so I spent a lot of time retting and dew retting, water
You were
retting.
saying you took over the family bath for.
Well, now and then, yeah, because I had to soak them, yeah. And we had a pond at the back, so I did pond retting. I tried river retting.
Could you explain retting?
Oh, retting is a fancy word for rotting.
Okay.
So the purpose of retting is to break down the plant material and the gums and pectins that hold the fibres together.
So the bits that aren't the fibre, it's kind of getting rid of those for you, or
Yeah. Do you want me to explain how nettles work?
yeah, go on then.
Okay. So there you have your nettle, and right on the inside there's a hollow tube.
Right.
Okay. And I mean there are various layers, but the main layers are out around that tube. You will have sort of xylem and phloem, those sort of feeding and water tubes.
Yeah, yeah.
Then and there are other cells all mixed in as well. Then outside of that you have what are called the sclerenchyma, which are the fibers. Right. Now, if you have flax are very thin and straight and homogeneous, really, and they have a high percentage of fibre to the stem in relation to the nettles. They've got more fibre in a flax stem, and they tend to, when you remove the fibre, it tends to come off in these strands, fibre strands. But in fact, the fibres on the bast fibres are not long strands. They're made up of lots of tiny fibre cells. So if you manage to break those down, remove all the gums and pectins and separate them from one another, they will be really small, but very, very fine. So I have this theory, and no one's ever contested it, and I've never even seen anyone really say anything. I'm sure there's an expert out there who can clarify this. So my belief is that when a nettle grows, this is the maximum time growth time for the fibres, the fibre cells, because their purpose is to support the stem as it grows up. You know, nettles grow quite quickly, so you can imagine that the core is quite soft. So when they're growing fast and they're growing their leaves, they would probably fall over if they didn't have the support of these fibres.
Can I just stop you because it makes me realise I've had a misapprehension about this. I thought that the xylem and phloem, as you say, is that the same as the vascular bundles? Is that correct, or is that? Anyway, I thought that those tubes that are communicating the stuff up the stem, that they were giving it structure. But you're saying that it's actually the fibres that are giving it the structure. So
well, I'm sure that they have their part to play. I mean, I'm not such an expert that I know really, but I all I know is that they are where the water and the food sort of feeds the plant, but the fibres are there to strengthen the plant.
So if they're providing support, they need the extra support of the fibres.
Yeah. And then what happens is that as the plant matures, that core in the middle starts to lignify. So it has lignin forming in it, which turns it into wood. It doesn't need the fibres anymore then.
Okay.
But they're still there, obviously. So, which brings me to my other theory, in which when I did my MPhil in nettle fibre extraction, which is also a rather long story, but I had my final study was really, I was sampling nettle stems in different places. So I had 3 places. This is my major study, and I would every week I would harvest a certain number, and then I would go through all the weighing process, and I would take samples to look at in a microscope, and then I would chop them into certain lengths, and then I'd take them back to university. Then I would remove the fibres chemically with sodium hydroxide and ammonia acetic acid, and a lot of water, mess everywhere. And when it was dried, then I'd weigh this fibre and that sort of thing. So and what I discovered, and I believe this is my thing, is that I don't believe that nettle fibre increases significantly in relation to the stem the longer you leave it. It's easier to process fibre and remove it from the stem earlier on with not much loss, really, I don't think, compared to if you leave it until after the end of summer, when you've got that wooden core in the middle that's gone hard and and everything is becoming tough. Even the bark, the plant material on the outside, it's thickening up, and it starts to absorb the nettles into the core and into the bast. So it's much harder to take off.
I'll tell you what that's making me think, because one of my kind of main thoughts is how could we get more yield from wild landscapes, no matter what we're doing with them, and when that comes to food, I often say to people who are worried about over harvesting that they're worrying about nothing in most cases, because all we're doing is effectively like we're mowing the lawn. So we cut leaves and they grow back, and it doesn't exhaust the plant. They've evolved to cope with this, just like a lawn can cope with being mowed because it's evolved to cope with grazing animals grazing it. So I've been thinking about what nettles are good for. Obviously, they're good for eating the young greens, and you can do numerous things with those. You can even dry them for tea and whatever. And then I harvest the seeds in the autumn. I've been thinking along the lines of you leave the canes there to rot over the winter, which is what some people do, isn't it? And then you harvest them. But what you're suggesting, it seems to me, allows for a multiple harvest of stems, because if you cut that stem before the flower has finished doing its business, the plant will just produce another one. So you could potentially get
Well,
4 or 5 or yields of stems in a single season.
well, I think that in theory that might work, but the problem is you've got branching then, because you don't have the same stem growing up again. You have more coming out. Though it's like coppicing, when you cut down that central trunk, it sends out new shoots from below or wherever it wants to go.
Is branching a problem?
Pardon?
Is branching a problem? Could you still use it with the?
Maybe not. I mean, I think that's worth, it's worth investigating that. In fact, Alan, Brown, who started the Facebook page, and he is now Nettle Man, I will say, and you should interview him.
And we've got a series on that. It'd be great.
Yeah, he might have something to say about that, because I did all this many years ago, and things have moved on. People have been sharing information, and I was basically on my own with no one to really ask, except I did have some people who were helpful, but
now there's a whole community, it seems, of people talking to each other and
there
sharing.
is some people doing some really good stuff actually. But anyway, so what I did was, I eventually, although I experimented and tried, I wasn't trying to produce cloth because I don't have the textile skills to do that.
Right.
So I then moved on to looking at the history of nettle fibre use, and which no one else was doing.
Can I just quickly clarify what you did in the lab with all of those chemicals?
Yeah.
That was just basically very heavy chemically based retting in effect. That is retting. Whereas what you did in your bath, what were you doing in your bath?
Well, the bath stuff wasn't. I even tried a sheep's trough. That didn't work very well. The thing is, it worked in the pond because you have more water. You've got the right sort of bacteria, and you don't in the sheep's, and you also got the right temperature because it's a bit erratic. These are things you can't pin them down scientifically. This is the thing. You can't say you need to do this, this, and this, because you can't control those elements involved. You can't control the bacteria in the pond. You can't control the temperature. You can't control the outside weather either. So you just have to, like people do. When you develop this instinct of knowing, you can't pin that into a shape or you can't pin that down. It's just something it's like when I cook a cake, I listen to see if it's ready. I don't do it really by time because it doesn't work like that. Things are always changing, nothing's ever the same. So I listen to see if it's ready.
Are you listening to yourself or looking at the cake and allowing that to give you information as well?
I look at the cake. If it looks as though it could be done, it may not be done, and I have to know what's going on inside. So that's when I listen. And I normally get it right, although I have burnt my face in the past.
So you're actually listening to the cake? You're putting your ear next to the cake?
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought you meant you were listening to your gut, your inner...
No, I actually listen to the cake.
Listening to the cake.
I've made many cakes. Anyway, so this is a sort of thing that you develop a sort of inner instinct of when that is ready, when that's done, when that's right,
Okay, but you've just told me that when you use that instinct in regard to cake, you're using your senses in a very particular way by putting your ear next to the cake.
Yeah.
So how do you use your senses to know when the thing's retted?
Well, you look at it, you feel it, you check it,
You get,
and you sort of,
you get,
you just do this or whatever, and you would know. Like many things in life that people do and people used to in the past, they would know when something was ready. Like the farmer knows when his corn's ready, and all those things. You're not doing it by machines. You're not doing it by, or any sort of
you,
technological way.
yeah,
You're
you don't have a retometer that you just put your
no,
finger in.
no, no. And so you sort of know whether it's ready or not. So anyway, I did have quite a lot of success in pond retting, and then I would boil things up in wood ash, and which would break down the gums and things. But I wasn't concerned with producing a large end product. I wanted to know how it worked, and I was trying out all sorts. I came across all sorts of different methods, and I would just keep testing them and testing them because I was interested in the process.
Mm.
In university, it has to be done with a view to commercialization, obviously. So you're having to write down every single detail, every single variable. It was only done in very small quantity. So in terms of pollution, it wasn't creating vast amounts of pollution, but it was producing results that gave more knowledge and things. So, and it was an effective way of extracting the fibre, but very heavy duty. You just wouldn't do it normally.
You're using the sodium hydroxide and whatnot, yeah.
Yeah, and very high, very hot oven, and then acetic acid and ammonia, and lots of water for cleaning it up and things.
Just so that we kind of thoroughly, or as thoroughly as we can, covered the retting thing. I will just say that the very small amount of research I've done, but I spoke to the people that I mentioned in the email. I've been to see that factory, that mill, Yorkshire, where they're making nettles from nettle fibre and wool. By the way, in answer to your question, they're getting their nettles from the grounds of a power station.
Okay.
And those nettles have been selectively bred. So their project, you probably know, it comes out of this DEFRA-funded project called Sting that happened in the 90s.
Yeah, well, I can tell you all about Sting. Sting was going on when I was doing my MPhil.
Okay.
And I was asked by the professor to come and do an M. I rang him because I wanted to know, what's about this project you're going to do? And he said, well, why don't you come up and talk to us? So I went to Leicester, and at the end of this conversation, they said, would you like to come and do an MPhil on nettle fibre extraction? Wow. So I said, well, that's something, isn't it? So I said yes. So I did my MPhil while that project was starting.
Okay.
And I know about Chimera, and I also know how they got their crossbred ones. These are the Brademan clones, actually, produced between the wars by Gustav Brademan in Germany. I gave them the contact who produced these, actually. So I was slightly instrumental in that. And
find you. I was trying to find nettle people about 10 years ago. I just couldn't find anyone, yeah.
Isn't that odd? So so I'm the person who was producing these at the time. This is Jens Dreyer, who was a young German man, who in the late 90s he was at Hamburg Botanical Institute doing a PhD, and what he did was they still had the original nettle clone. They called them clones, but they weren't genetically modified. Obviously, they were just crossbred. And they still had these the original stock, but they couldn't remember, or he wanted to retest them to see if they still had the qualities that they were supposed to have had. So that was his PhD, to reevaluate these clones, and then he went on to start to propagate them as well. I even went to Germany because I'm still friends with Jens. He's a lovely man, actually. He came to visit me a couple of years ago with his wife and dog, and he invited me, and I went and stayed with him and helped in his greenhouse with his helpers propagating these nettle clones. So that was quite fun. Anyway, so I saw the field of cultivated nettles that were being cultivated in Leicester at the time. And I do know that they went on, that what had to be happen is they had to be transported, the stems had to go to Cornwall because there was a farmer there who had a decorticator. It was a bit complicated. I don't know all the details, and it was a long time ago. But Kamira was the person who was taking the fibre and using it. So I'm glad that they're still using local nettles rather than importing them, because once they get imported, then I get suspicious.
Well, I was just because the wool was coming from New Zealand, but they said that the particular qualities they wanted. There wasn't an English wool that had this. I forget what the spec was, but they said, but we don't have an English wool that can do this. But it was nettles made that were being grown on the grounds of a power station for some reason, and harvested every year. And then the end result of this fabric they were making, which we saw great rolls of, took some away. We were thinking of making a bag from them, which messed do it, but like a foraging bag. But anyway, they're mostly being used for upholstery fabric in the north of England for trains and buses. So I just think it's charming.
But I wonder who's processing the fibre. Are they doing it?
No, I don't think so. I think they get well, maybe they are, but we didn't see. Did we see the fibre? I think we just saw rolls of fabric. Oh, I don't know. I can't remember. We had a whole tour of the place. But I can't remember if we saw the fibre. But what they told me about the retting process was that part of the Sting project findings had been that if you just leave the nettles over winter, that then the following spring that the retting has already happened. Now I've had a quick look on the nettle group that you put me on. I think there's some disagreement about that. Some people say, well, by springtime they've over retted and or not enough, and it doesn't seem to be as reliable as this chap was implying. But still, that did seem to be an interesting thing that people realise you do get a sort of retting process that happens if you just leave them alone and come back in the spring.
Yeah, they see that all. See, everyone's right and everyone's wrong.
Okay.
You're then depending on variables that you can't control.
Yeah.
So, sometimes it will work and sometimes it won't, depending on the weather you put them, depending on the weather, the conditions. You can't determine that. It will happen.
Can you tune your intuition and your hands and so on to go out and feel those things and keep an eye on a patch and say, okay, they're just right now, or they're not quite, or you think you could do that?
I'm sure that, I tell you what, if they're going to use them in a commercial product, they're not going to just let them get on there. They will be monitoring them.
Well, that's true. So actually, that's the proof of the pudding's in the eating, isn't it? So that's what they're doing. They're taking them. They're not using these great big ponds to ret them in. They are actually leaving them over winter. So there must be somebody that's keeping an eye on them to see when they're ready.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just wanted to make sure that we've gone into all of that retting stuff that we possibly could. Just to say, okay, just one last thing. Retting and rotting. Of course, rotting involves microbial stuff. So strictly speaking, the stuff that's happening in your pond was retting according to that definition. But when you're just using the chemicals in the lab, that isn't strictly speaking rotting, because there's no.
No, it's not rotting. Well, it is. It's rotting very fast. It's rotting, artificial rotting.
Just depends whether we're saying the microbial thing is part of the definition of rotting. But anyway, I'm just a bit of a stickler for definition, so I just wanted to clarify that.
Well, of course.
Yes.
Just say that dew retting uses fungi, so that the retting process is different because it uses fungi rather than bacteria.
What is dew retting?
Dew retting is when you just lay it on the grass.
Okay.
Oh, of course. Maybe that's what they're doing. They're dew retting. Kamira?
No, they leave it. They leave them standing.
Oh, do they?
Yeah, they leave them standing. There may be more to it than what he said, but it did seem to be that was at least part of their process to leave them standing for longer than people used to. Yeah.
Wow, this is interesting. Yeah. The thing is, if you've got a nettle patch in your garden, I have generally found at the end of a winter, I mean, I've always been aware of nettles, I pull them around, poke them and this sort of thing. And you do get fibre off them, but it's rather bit sparse normally, and I would think probably not as strong as if you rescued it earlier in the season, because it's been out there in the elements. It will weaken. It won't be as strong.
Further inquiry needed.
Yeah, yeah.
I kind of steered us back onto that to make sure we'd covered all the reading ground that we could, at least broadly speaking. So, but you were about to launch into, then you moved into the history side more so.
Yeah, yeah. So my book, in fact, I went and did my MPhil. Still hadn't written a book, you know.
Okay.
So there is a significant amount about the history in my thesis, but I still had this book to write and I had a draft, and I had it, you know how it is, a book can take a long time to come together. And in the meantime, I was doing all the other things in my life that I do. I was actually, at the time, I was teaching environmental education. I was a field study teacher, so I was doing that. And one person in another field study place said, "Oh, would you come and do a Nettle Day?" So I did, because at the time there was a website called Be Nice to Nettles Week, and it was I think you can still find it, but it's not really, it doesn't seem very active anymore. So for a few years, this whoever it was set up this Nettle place, and I actually sort of wrote into them and said, actually, you know, there's one or two things on your website that are not quite right. See, I did it again. Yeah, but actually, I'll tell you about that in a minute, because in fact, it's really important to stop false information from being spread around. Anyway, so I contacted them, and what they had on their website was events. So they determined that in a certain week in May, I think it was the end of May, this was Be Nice to Nettles Week, and it became a national thing, and people would hold nettle events. And one of the local field study centres said, would you come and do a Nettle Day? So I went and did this Nettle Day. Now, I happen to have a contact in the Natural History Museum. His name's Roy Vickery. He actually wrote the foreword to my book. And Roy is a really amazing person. He's retired now, but he has been, for years, he's been gathering plant folklore. And he had this, people used to send stuff into him. So every time he had anything about nettles, he'd send it on to me. You know, when you go out there researching, sometimes a lot of people are just not interested, they don't respond. Then some people become really helpful, you know, and it's wonderful. And I do remember, I'd never met him, but one day I had to go to London to collect some passports, and I had several hours free. So I thought, oh, I'll just nip over to the Natural History Museum and see if I can find Roy's. Yep. I sort of gate crashed him. And he was so kind. He looked a bit taken aback for a minute. Oh, here's this woman. But he took me to the herbarium. I'd never been to a herbarium before, and I sat and looked at the nettles in this herbarium, and it was just wonderful. You know, have you been to a herbarium? I mean, amazing places.
I've been to the one at the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. Yeah.
So that was a wonderful thing. Anyway, so then I mentioned it to Roy that, you know, I was going to do this Nettle Day, and he said, oh, we should have one at the Natural History Museum. So for a few years, they had these nettle weekends, and sort of based in the wildlife garden. I made friends with Caroline Ware, who was running that garden, and you know, it was so nice to be able to go up there. But anyway, one year they said, oh, would you be able to bring your book? Well, it wasn't ready, so I had to rush to get this book finished so that I could take it up there when I went for the Nettle weekend. And that was in 2010.
You had a deadline.
Pardon?
You found a deadline.
I had a deadline, but unfortunately, because of the deadline, it was not as good as I wanted it to be. You know, there were errors in there, and I felt unsatisfied with it. It was not right. So I knew in my head that I needed to redo it, and I've been redoing it in my head for many years. But then, of course, the Nettles to Textiles group made me realise I have to actually do it now, because we need to get the facts out there.
Yeah.
So the thing is, it's very, you know, in history, and it happens not just with nettles, but in all of history, there are lots of errors because misinformation can get in. And now, of course, things get very widely spread and books become popular. And if books that are popular and well known put down in the information that is not quite right, then it becomes really fixed and it's difficult to shift. So
I think it's so Oliver Rackham was very tough on this. He called those things bibliographic echoes. So someone says something that's wrong and somebody else reads it and repeats it in another book, and that's called a bibliographic echo, and it keeps going down. But like, there's something worse than that happening now, obviously, which is why it's so important that you email people and tell them that they've got things that are wrong on their website. Because, you know, it's so funny because I was just telling my daughter this week, she's going, oh, well, I Googled this and blah, blah, blah. I said, yeah, so, you know, that's true then. She said, well, I said, look, darling, anyone can put anything up on the internet.
Yeah.
And if, unfortunately, that person's website is getting more hits than anybody else's, all of a sudden it's got this sort of apparent truth claim because it's the first thing that came up on Google. You opened it up and you think it's the truth. Whereas, I mean, I've sincerely written something wrong in my webpage, and people think I'm an expert. They're reading my wrong thing, which I will get changed this week, and they go around repeating my error that Nettles is the major fibre crop in Europe. So I mean, I completely agree, but like websites make it worse, I think, because
they do now, yeah.
Go to a library and take the trouble to find a book and start reading it. You just Google it, nettle fibre, and you get this factoid come out, which then gets repeated on 50,000 other websites. It's so yeah. I mean, I think it's anyway. I agree with you.
Well, when I was doing my research, I mean, I got to, when I looked in the book, I didn't even bother to look in the book. I looked to see if it had references first, because if there are no references, then it was useless to me. Because what I needed to do is then go to that reference, and so I would keep tracking back on anything that I found. I kept tracking back until I got to the original source, if I could, and then not only looked at that original source, but looked at its context.
Yep.
Because, you know, a source can mean all sorts of things depending on what caused that source to be created. And
sorry to keep butting in, but I just can't resist just pointing this out. Like, so we had a 4-year battle with Natural England, which actually we kind of lost in the end because the legal process didn't seem to be interested in the actual facts or the evidence. They just said they're Natural England, so they must be right. But part of Natural England's case against us, because we were harvesting sea kale down at Dungeness, and they dragged out these old historical floras. Well, this guy called Jonathan Cox did. He was their plant expert witness from Dorset, tracking the supposed state of health of the populations of sea kale down there. And so one guy at one point says there's loads of sea kale. And then another guy, because it changes, who is the county recorder? You know, that's what the BSBI have. They have a guy in each county that's recording the flora. And at one point, or whether it was the BSBI, but anyway, the authority who was making records at that time obviously then changed. There'll be a new one a few years later. And they managed to present this case saying, oh, look, here, this guy said there's loads of sea kale. This guy says there isn't any. And in the meantime, we know that people were picking sea kale. Therefore, because people were picking sea kale, they've wiped it out. And that's why this guy's saying there's none there, right? And that looked very compelling. And you know, I looked at that and thought, okay, it's compelling, but I know better, because I know that when we pick the sea kale and we pick a lot of it, it just grows back. So that can't be right. There must be, if it's true that the sea kale declined, it must be for a different reason. But nevertheless, in the meantime, I contacted David Pearman, who not only has been the county recorder for Dorset himself, he is also a sort of amateur historian of botanists in a way. And he knows the story of all of those guys who published those floras and whose evidence was being presented. And he ripped it to shreds. He said, this guy, I know for a fact he went to this end of Chesil Beach and not that end. And it's the other end that the sea kale's at. This guy only came to Dorset at a certain time of year and did his botanizing within a very short period. And he never went to the places where the sea kale grew. So it was only one of the guys that actually walked the beaches where the sea kale was. And he said there's plenty of sea kale. So, you know, it just, you, as you say, you have to interrogate. You have to have someone that's got the
Yeah.
know-how to interrogate. Well, actually, what is the basis of what is written down here? And it turns out what lies behind it in our case was well, things were not what they seemed. Basically, these guys were not qualified to say whether something was there or not because they hadn't been there at the right time, or they either hadn't been there or they hadn't been there at the right time. Yeah.
Well, you're trying to find the truth, aren't you?
Yeah.
That's basically that's what you're trying to do, not just write something that is just entertaining for somebody. For me, I have to live with myself having, I worry about my book. I worry because this book for me is like this big jigsaw puzzle. And what I've done is I've got all these pieces and I've managed to put lots together, but there are all these stray ones as well, and there are these big holes, and some pieces seem completely missing, and some seem stuck under the cupboard or something like that. And I know that there are answers, and even what I've written will have to be challenged at times because someone will come up with information that has a better context and has more substance. And I know that, and I never want to write that book again. But I hope that people will make more sense of the picture. If people tell me I'm wrong, that's fine. If they tell me that I'm wrong simply because that's what they feel, it's an idea they've got, and people have done that. Oh no, 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 no. But I say, okay, you're saying I'm wrong, but I need you to give me evidence of why I'm wrong. And then when you're giving the evidence, I acknowledge that I will be wrong. But someone had to start somewhere, and
Exactly. You say that you want to know the truth, and yeah, I mean, actually, that reminds me of Oliver Rackham again. Do you know if you said something to Oliver Rackham and he thought you were talking rubbish, do you know what he'd say to you? He'd say, "I'd like to see some evidence for that." And when he first said it, I didn't realize just how much of us, how kind of deeply he was basically saying you're talking crap. You were talking crap if Oliver Rackham said to you, "I'd like to see some evidence for that," basically. Yeah. But you say that you want to know the truth, right? Yeah. But unfortunately, there are a bunch of people out there, including Natural England and the judge in our case. But across the board, there's in this we do live in this. A lot of people are living in this post-truth zone. I don't even know what I call that, because I think there's a whole kind of lot of space that people occupy that never has cared about the truth. I think if you're honestly saying, I don't care if I'm wrong, just give me some further light on the subject, I think that's where we've got to stand. But unfortunately, a lot of people are not standing there. They're saying, no, I don't care about the truth. I care about shoring up my preconceived position, and don't touch it because I feel comfortable here. This is the way I want the world to be. I've managed to construct lots of things that prove to myself that I'm right, and don't mess with it because I don't want to do this difficult business of deconstructing what I think is true. I'm quite happy being where I am. And I think that's awful, actually. I do think that's awful.
I don't understand it.
But I'm afraid we have to just be realistic. Not everybody is trying to get to the truth. Some people are deliberately, and big, powerful forces in the world today. Unfortunately, I mean, it's all right if your neighbor just wants to be ignorant and believe that the Russians didn't really land on the moon and whatever. You think, okay, fair enough. Flat earthers, fair enough. I mean, you have to just kind of shake your head and walk on. But like when massive, powerful forces like governments and corporations are deliberately concealing truth, just because that's going to upset the status quo if we get to it. Now that's it. Anyway. Gone off on one.
We could go on to politics next, couldn't we? Let's not.
Yeah. No, let's stick to Nettles. Let's stick to the wonderful Nettle journey that you've been on.
So anyway, so I have republished my book this year, with the help of my son, who is actually an architect in Paris. He proofread it really fiercely, but actually we worked really well together, because if I said no, I really can't change that, because I knew why he just accepted it. But it was sort of weird to be proofread by your son. And he put the book together as well, actually. And the cover's got a photo by Alan Brown, because he's taken some wonderful pictures of his nettle fibre. So I feel
I've seen some. They're beautiful. They're absolutely beautiful.
I know. So it's been a joint effort, really. but I feel I can draw the line under it now. And now it's for someone else to take it forward. But if it turns out that I'm wrong, that's fine, because I had to do, I had to present the information. I remember Laura, from Q. I remember her years ago. She said to me, "Gillian, you've got to publish this." And I felt like I had this responsibility first time round to present what I'd found, and whatever people did with it after that was up to them. It's fine. I've done my bit. I can move on to other things and try. So.
Can you kind of let me in on some of what you found? Like, I mean, what's the how far back, for example, how far back does people using nettle fibre go? Is it like, do we go right back to Paleolithic times? Is there evidence from there, or is it just it's hard to gather that kind of evidence?
I've written in there whatever I found about any archaeological finds that are at least proved or thought to be nettle fibre. I've qualified it if it's uncertain. So I've put all of those in, and of course, as time goes by, the identification methods have become so more sophisticated now. I remember when I actually went to County Durham to do a nettle identification course. I wasn't very popular, actually, because this was a famous identification woman. I went on her course, and I took up my little bag of nettle fibre. And she wouldn't she wouldn't allow us to look at it at all. She was quite cross with me. I don't know why. I don't understand. Anyway, so I did this course, which is really useful. And I remember going after that to Denmark, to Copenhagen, to look at the various nettle fibre samples they had there, including the Voldofter piece. There's a little piece. The most famous archaeological nettle find is the Voldofter find, which was a grave find. And the funny thing was that they'd lost it in a cupboard. I think because nettle fibre I think they hadn't really.
So who was that?
This was just in the museum. It wasn't really lost. It's just they had to rummage in the cupboard to find it. And it's a really, really famous piece of cloth. Anyway, so I saw this and various other things. And I remember going to one of their offshoot places, and this woman showing me this amazing piece of what she said was nettle fibre, but it had been brought in and they wanted to identify it. And she said to me, "How do we identify this?" I thought, why are you asking me? Am I really the only one left? But anyway, I think people had got to the end.
Were you able to?
Oh, no. There's no way I could have done it. But I think they'd got to the end of their resources in being able to identify the difference between nettle and something like flax. That was the problem. But now, of course, they're using far more sophisticated methods, which I've written about in my book, but I can't remember because it's quite technical, and so I've had to do that very carefully. But they're getting to the point where they're able to actually determine whether something is nettle. Is it isotopes and things like that? So they're finding out not only whether it's nettle, but where it actually grew as well. So things have got quite clever. Yeah. And so it opens up all sorts of possibilities for further identification. But of course, nettles cloth doesn't last very well in the ground, so it's not always easy to find samples. So that's quite interesting. But then I've tried to look at the issue of language, because when we say nettle, well, as you know, there are a large number of nettles in the Urticaceae family. So, and various genera have plants in them that have fibre in the stems. So they're used in different parts of the world. But, we don't have many in this country. We've got the dioica and the urines. And we've got pelletry on the wall. Now,
I was going to ask you
you can't
say about that.
get much fibre from that, but it's a nettle species. You know, it's bizarre, isn't it? So, but anyway, within that big picture, you've got the Nepalese nettle, that's an Urticaceae in the Urticaceae family, and you've got rami. Now, rami is being produced for, it started being produced in China and in India. Also grows wild in different countries. So, but it's been a commercial crop for a long, long time. It doesn't grow very well over here at all. They have grown it in some parts of Europe, but they have imported rami for a long time. So Europeans have been importing rami. Sorry?
That's an Urtica species?
No, that's a Bomeria.
But still within the same.
Yeah, still within the that is genera or genus is Bomeria. So people have been using that as a source of fibre for cloth, and it makes a very fine cloth. And if you see rami, it's got quite long, very white, shiny fibres. You can buy it easily, it's available. But of course, it's called nettle, and the same with the Nepalese nettle, the Girardinia diversifolia. That is also called a nettle. They are nettles, but they don't grow here, and it's not our nettle. So when we talk about nettle, we think of the stingy nettle, but people also use these different fibres. And if it says nettle on there, it could mean those, and that's fine. They are nettles, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's stingy nettle fibre. So if you go back in time and look at records about when it refers to a nettle, so what nettle are they referring to? Are they referring to an import, or are they referring to our native stingy nettle? So you have to always be having that in your head as well, and looking at the context, looking at the possibilities, looking at the wider history. I had to look up amazing bits of history to find out the context of where nettle might fit into this. So I've tried to do this with records that I can only use what's there to be looked at. But I did discover that nettles kept having a revival when there was a crisis in history. So the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil Wars, the World Wars. When imports were restricted, and suddenly people got, we'll get some fibre out of nettles.
Imports of cotton.
Yeah. So certainly American Civil War. That was mostly to do with the imports of cotton, but and also probably the two world wars as well, because we've become dependent on cotton then as well, hadn't we? I'm not sure about the Napoleonic War, so it could have been cotton, because the Industrial Revolution had got revved up by then, hadn't it? It's sort of into its swing. So
the story that I've told lots of times, and I'm just hoping this isn't a bibliographic echo, is that the First World War German army uniforms were made from nettle.
Yeah, Mrs. Grieve, botanical herbal.
Was she right or was she wrong? Come on.
Well, there's another thing in there that she's written that I really pursued, and it was sort of dodgy thing that she'd written. But I can't say no until I've proved otherwise. But Jens in Hamburg did say to me many years ago that there was not a lot left evidence of that. And when I've read all the stuff around the World War One, certainly World War One publication, this is what I found in Kew. A lot of stuff that people had written, a lot of it was propaganda. And also there is these other possibility that it could have been rami.
Okay.
Because that's also a nettle, and there is a reference somewhere to the use of rami in soldiers' uniforms. But I think until it's proved otherwise, I would prefer to be suspicious.
Yeah.
I would want the evidence. My default position is suspicion. Only because I've, learned to be suspicious and not just take things at face value, but to say, okay, so this is interesting. Can we follow this up? Can we find, where does it come from? What is the evidence for this? And so often, it just falls to pieces. So sorry about that. It's just
you're Oliver Rackhaming me. I love it.
No, I'm not at all. No, you actually, I'm glad you brought that one up because it's a very common one and it gets really going out. It's really out there, that one. And it may.
I love a good story, but the thing is, we just don't want to find ourselves guilty with these really important subjects of really, when push comes to shove, our philosophy is don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. So except that is a great story about the First World War army uniforms, but if that's as thin as the evidence is that Grieve said it and everybody's been repeating it ever since. See, I've forgotten where I got it from. That's the problem with bibliographic echoes. I was studying that book. It's probably where I got it from, but I didn't inquire. I didn't interrogate it as hard as you have.
Well, you'd have to do it for the rest of your life because she's got a lot of information in her book, isn't she?
Yeah.
The thing is, if someone comes along now and says, actually, no, you are wrong, they really were used, and this is the evidence for that,
that's it.
That's fine. But the thing is that Gustav Bredemann wrote a book which he published in 1950 called Die große Brennnessel, and it's a very famous book if you can read German. Well, when I first got in contact with Jens, it's unbelievable. He posted, oh, this is really dangerous. Hang on, just got to calculate time. Okay, we're past the 70 years copyright thing, nearly. He sent me a copy of this book, and I photocopied it, every page, and I've used a small section of it because I can't read, it's quite complex and things. I would love to be able to read it, but I don't think he says, I don't know, maybe he says in there about First World War. Anyway, so I would be very happy if someone could come along and say, actually they were used and this is the evidence for it. That's fine, because that's the truth. But I haven't found that truth yet. I just haven't found it.
No, I think it's great. We want to have a proper evidence base for what we're doing, because otherwise we're just talking nonsense. We're just yet another crowd of people spinning a good yarn.
Yeah. Oh, I know, because what Bredemann did say in his book, he said, if anyone had managed to find an effective way of extracting nettle fibre, we would know about it. And also, after the First World War, he and another man went on to try and continue the research, which is also evidence to me that all these claims of what were going on in the First World War were meaningless, because otherwise they would have carried on, wouldn't they? But then it was after that they decided to try and crossbreed these nettles to produce a higher quantity of fibre in the stem. So, there was all sorts of things went on during the wars, and who knows what's true and who knows what's propaganda.
Can we get down to what is the prospect for the future? Because we're looking back and saying, well, we're not really sure to what extent it was done. We know it was done, and it can be done, but it seems to me that you're suggesting that like a large-scale manufacture of German army uniforms would have been tricky, because at that time they didn't have techniques to make particularly efficient means of production. But what is your opinion? Given that we have all of the kind of science and technology at our fingertips now, and we have all these tinkering people that can talk to each other and help move forward a lot faster than people could have done in the past, do you think there is a realistic prospect of there being a large scale, even if it's cottage industry scale, or it could be part industrial process, part cottage industry with the fibre? I mean, that's what I'm guessing, that we need some maybe industrial processes to speed up the processing to get a woven thread from it, and then people could cottage industry the next bit. I mean, but anyway, what do you think?
During the 90s and beginning of the century, there were several projects going on around Europe to extract nettle fibre. Those projects have all come to an end. Now, it may be that the funding ran out, because it takes several years to set that sort of project up, because you've got to grow the nettles probably in the first place. Most of them have used the nettle fibre clones, the crossbred nettles, high fibre nettles. Anyway, what I found very, very difficult when I was doing my MPhil was, although I looked at all these academic papers and about these various projects, they don't give you all the information that you would need to carry on to another project. So my opinion is that within academia, there's a lot of keeping information back for whatever reason. And I think that's a bit sad. Also, within the commercial sector, people are keeping back information. They don't share information about processes and sources and things like that because this is their thing and they want to make a profit. So there's a problem here. The nice thing about the Nettles for Textiles, although it's not commercial, it's not academic, the purpose of that group is to share information. And because information is shared, then that builds a bigger body of knowledge that people can use and work on. The thing is with commercialization that you need homogeneity. How do you say that word? Homogeneity.
Yeah.
And nettles are not homogeneous.
Yeah.
They are different. They have different size stems. They grow to different heights. They have nodes on them which get in the way. So already, right from the beginning, they are a problem because once you're starting to create processing machinery, you've got to take those things into consideration. People are using, on a sort of artisan basis, they're using different methods of extracting fibre which produce a different end product. Some people are using full length, what they call nettle fibres, which in fact are the glued together little tiny fibre cells.
Okay.
So they're in fact not, they're just in nettles because they're quite loosely connected compared with flax. In fact, flax are much tighter together. So in the commercial sector, they want to separate these single fibres and to then, obviously because you get then a very, very fine cloth, like cotton, potentially, because it's that fine. But the fibres are relatively short, so you can't use cotton machinery because it can't adapt to the shorter fibres. Now, I'm very happy for people to correct me on any of this, but these are my feelings, is that we live in a world where academia and businesses are not willing necessarily to share what they've got freely. But there is a paper that I wrote with my supervisor, and she did most of the work, but she needed me to do various bits. And it's quite a well-known one that people want to read. And it was published in a journal. And then this was bought up by some company. We didn't even get a copy of the journal. We weren't allowed to have one unless we bought one, even though it was written for nothing. And now, if I wanted a copy, except I've got one, if I wanted a copy of that article, I'd have to pay for it. And I think that isn't fair, actually, because what is this company doing, taking my work and selling it on? So I've made that available if people want it, because I should probably go to prison after this. Someone's going to come and arrest me for declaring all these things. But
they should go to prison, or at least hang their head in shame, that they profit from other people's knowledge, and also that they're not disseminating that knowledge.
I know. So there are these problems within the commercial sector, and after all these various projects that have been done, one after the other, where is the nettle fibre? Where is it? Who's producing the cloth apart from Camira? I mean, there are one or two little places that you hear about, but they don't tend to want to tell you anything about what they're doing or where they get their nettles from. Because I always ask, where are your nettles coming from? Because if they then say China, I think, when they're probably not stinging nettles, then are they? That's my chain of thought. But I've had this discussion with people, and my fear is that if companies or academia come and take the knowledge that is being shared, like on a Facebook page, and then use it for their own purposes and don't give anything back, I feel that's sort of like stolen information. This world doesn't need to be keeping that knowledge, because I've seen it with a lot of people, like local historians. Sometimes you come across and they've done all this research and they're not going to let anyone publish it or see it.
It's mine. It's my research.
But what they don't realise, it will die with them because no one else is going to be interested in looking at it. You know, when you research, if you share that, then it enriches someone else's research. It all becomes bigger and bigger. So, and this is what we need to do. We've got a lot of problems in the world. We need to be sharing information about how to solve the problems. And the same with nettle fibre, we should be sharing. But I'm not sure that that will happen within the commercial sector. But I do see a future for artisan people developing a technique that can almost mass produce and be doing it within communities. You know, I think it's for us, the people who are involved in sort of managing the Nettles for Textiles stuff. We all have the same philosophy that the information is for sharing, and we want to see this being making people's lives better, or creating work possibilities, or all those sort of sustainable things that we should be working for. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. I mean, yeah, that's great. It's great to get that perspective. I mean, I'd add another one to that list. Mm-hmm. For me, it's land use, like, because one of our big things, what we're trying to do with Forage and with the more recent thing we set up called World Wild, which is a community interest company. So everything we're outputting is really working towards a specific end, and that's like change of land use, change of relationship between people and land. And that the idea with that, it is basically what is at the heart of what was being bandied around in 1992 about sustainable development with the big Rio summit there, which as I see it is trying to reconcile the apparent conflict of interest between human need for stuff and places to live and transport infrastructure and all of that, all of the needs of civilization, and the need of the rest of the biosphere to maintain, the species diversity and the abundance of populations. That we don't just have lots of species that are not going extinct but just hanging on by a thread, if you pardon the pun in the light of this conversation, and that we basically have the biosphere thriving and us thriving. This idea, and to reconcile the tension between the two, it seems to me, is we have to get our acquisition of resources and everything else that we need, whether that's transport infrastructure or housing or whatever, has to start working within the flow of life, within what is being produced by these organic systems, or what is being produced by the sun, for example, or winds or waves or whatever. And so for me, my fascination with nettles is the fact that they are potentially an organism which is abundant, self-sustaining, hard to get rid of, all of the things you'd want from a crop, but one that lends itself to multiple use by humans, but is also providing multiple benefits in terms of ecology, because it supports all kinds of insect life and whatnot. So for me, that I'll just add that to the end of the list, like the cottage industry, all of that stuff. But like, if we had a real strong economic use of nettles, then that would be. There's a bloke, I keep repeating this story, but there's a bloke for Scottish National Heritage. He was, when I spoke to him, their biodiversity officer. He was complaining about farmers not tidying up so much anymore, and so loads of land was just being taken over by nettles, which for him was a bad thing because it didn't speak into the whole overall species diversity. But for me, it's a good thing, because imagine we're taking the pressure off other land that's being used to grow cotton or whatever, and now we're getting lots of fabric from nettle fibre from land that is basically wild land, because it's still it's part of the flow of all of this ecology. And we're also using the nettles for so I mean, if we list it, we've got nettles for leaf, for pestos and greens and teas. We've got nettle seed for all of the health benefits to that, and we've got the whole plant which can eventually be used to make fertilizer. But if we've got in the middle of that, we're harvesting it for fibre. anyway, that's my kind of Nettle manifesto there. But like in the light of the fact that it's basically sustainable land use, which resolves that tension between conservation and our need for stuff, you know.
There is a thing that's cropped up recently, an issue about if we harvest and because they really are important for invertebrates.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen BNK Davis Nettles for insects, and
Okay.
it's a really interesting, gives you quite a diverse look at insects. It's a book. Anyway,
the link that at the bottom of the page with along with the other. Yeah.
Okay. So we've had this discussion about if you like the early harvest of nettles, is that going to disrupt the sort of life cycles of, you know, butterflies laying their eggs and this sort of thing? I mean, I was clearing of some, they were near the vegetable plot. They were going to be seeding into my vegetable plot. I had to cut down some nettles, and I discovered a really beautiful, and I can't remember what it was, beautiful chrysalis on this nettle that I chopped down, and I felt really bad. You know, at least I photographed it, but I felt really bad because I thought, oh, if only I'd looked. Well, obviously you can't do that. But if you do decide, okay, we're going to do an early, it came to me when you were talking. If you do decide to grow a crop of nettles, maybe you need to have a variable crop. So you have one bit of crop for the leaves, one for the stems, so that if you're harvesting them at different times, whatever creatures are being disrupted can then move without having to go very far. They can just move over. You know, is all that a bit simplistic?
No,
but you know, the thing is, if they're going to be disrupted, they're going to need to go somewhere where they're happy. Yeah. So maybe you do a sort of multi-faceted crop instead of just one monoculture for fibre. Maybe that's the way to deal with that problem. I don't know.
Yeah.
But you could do that actually, couldn't you?
I just think that the main point is we're addressing these questions, you know, and if the intention is to have something that is, you know, just making our presence gentle, you know, that like we need to be able to have stuff that doesn't eradicate everything else. We're not just stomping all over everything and saying we need stuff, get out of the way. You know, if we're actually trying to reinvent a system of production, you know, that goes back to earlier times, but it's not going back. It's actually going forwards. That now we're looking at how can we design basically ecological systems of production that of course these questions are going to be asked from the outset, you know, not as things to throw obstacles in the way, but just think, well, we just need to think about this a bit more. But that's where the tinkering comes in, you know, because 50,000 nettle enthusiasts tinkering around, we're going to come up with something, unlike, as you say, these academics and corporations who will come up with something and hide it. You know, we'll come up with something and share it, and we'll get there. You know, because I look at the Aboriginal Australian situation, and I personally think that is the most advanced civilization that's ever occurred. So, well, you're ridiculous. Where was the technology? Well, their technology was the sophistication of their relationship with the land and other species. That was their technology. But that took 50,000 years to develop because they were very slowly tinkering, you know, and they could only communicate with the tribes at the other side of the continent along these song lines. And anyway, it was slow is my main point. And one of the things that I'm excited about, in spite of being quite a fierce critic of technology, is that the sort of things you're talking about, like with the Facebook page and the current situation with the internet, and the fact we're able to talk like this because you found me an email. I mean, all of this good stuff means that the information loops are much faster, but not at the expense of, like, with the fast information loops with smartphones becoming obsolete every 3 weeks and all that, where that's a real problem, and the pace of change is a real problem that we don't know what kind of world we're living in because it will change again next week. But this fast information loop is weaving us back into the fabric of life. That's what I find so exciting. So it sounds to me like you're not thinking that overnight we're going to have some incredible Nettle textile thing, but there are distinct possibilities. Yeah,
Yeah, but I would say on a much smaller scale,
yeah,
and a much more humane scale as
yeah,
well,
yeah.
which is more manageable and more you can make it more sustainable because you're doing it on a smaller scale, and it's benefiting in a lot of individual people instead of one lot of shareholders. That's what I would like.
By a smaller scale, and I know what you mean by a smaller scale. You're saying not a factory and not a huge production line, and not product being made as 3 million units of that one product. But I'm thinking on a larger scale, just in terms of the volume of nettles that people getting their hands on and turning into fibre, and fabric. That potentially if we develop these methods, basically, which is what we're talking about, that millions of people could be using some nettles that grow in their garden, just basically loads of nettle being used.
There is another issue as well, and that is our whole view of textiles as a whole. Because ideally, it would be wonderful to have a nettle fibre industry that replaced cotton, particularly cotton, and certainly plastics.
Worst of crops in
Yeah,
terms of the
but they're organic cotton that's grown sustainably is okay, but as an overall thing, cotton is a bad thing because of the pesticides and because of the amount of water it uses, and it has an unfortunate history as well. So it's
slavery, you mean?
Yeah. So you sort of makes you uncomfortable, but cotton is a wonderful cloth. It's one of the best, but it comes at a cost. So if we could produce nettle fibre to replace that, that would be good. But the problem is that people now want really cheap clothes. And in the past, there was a whole different outlook on textiles. People valued textiles. It was really difficult to produce textiles. It took a long time, a lot of work. People didn't have so many. And in fact, the poor only had, if you go back and got these historical collections, people of like medieval times or something like that, people had just one outfit or two outfits. They just used to wear the same thing over and over time all through their lives until it fell to pieces, or they just kept mending it anyway. And I'm sure it was quite smelly sometimes. But there were, and if you look at different cultures who have in the past, who like that Japanese culture, this idea of borrow, this way of mending things. So you continually, the poor had to do it, so they would keep all their spare bits of cloth. When something got ripped or broken, they would just mend it, stick a patch on with this lovely stitching, and then you would end up with these amazing garments that were like patchwork, which became an art form. Wow. And people do it now. They actually, you want to look it up, people produce borrow things.
You know what the art form was called in Japanese? Do you know what the name for that was?
It's borrow.
Oh, you've already said it. Borrow. Okay.
Yeah.
I thought you meant the English word, but borrow is the Japanese word.
Yeah, but well, I assume it is the Japanese word. But in my book, I talk about. I went to Japan actually, and to look at some nettle. That's another story. So what I did learn was that the people in the mountains, the landless people who don't own land, who only had access to the wild, and there's several fibre crops over there, wild fibre crop plants, and they made this cloth. They used what they used to do is they used to get a bast fibre warp, and then they would weave old bits of cotton or silk cloth in, and they would make whole new garments with this sort of recycled weaving, and it's called something like saki ori. And then they would just keep wearing this, and when it was not fit for one thing, then it would be used for something else, and so that in the end there was nothing left. So you don't get many samples left because it's all gone. It's all been fallen to bits. Yeah. So there was this, cloth was highly valued, but we don't have that anymore. We really have so much. It's coming out of our ears. I mean, it's mountains of throwaway stuff. And so we need a whole new view of cloth and its value and, understanding of its process. And so it becomes what it was, but not that people get cold, you know. I don't know how that problem is solved, but in terms of nettle fibre, people will not want to pay what it costs, because if you've got different people producing a small amount of nettle fibre, it's going to take a lot of that fibre to produce an outfit if they're going to be paid to do that. And that final outfit, would cost a fortune.
Yeah.
So there is a problem.
Yeah. But that's why I wonder, and as I say, this is not my definitely not my first port of call in terms of if I'm trying to imagine a future scenario. I'd try and wait until last to say, is there a high tech solution to this, or is there a chemical solution to this or something?
I mean, there should be. But I don't think chemicals are not the answer. But they have tried retting with enzymes.
Okay.
I don't know how progress has got on with that, but that is a potential use.
So
but
we
sorry.
might make a better production if we could find some kind of some solution that is scientifically informed or technologically assisted kind of thing.
Maybe other people will have the answers. Maybe my knowledge is too old now. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to see what the state of your, how you can reach into the possibilities, with what you know. That's and I'm sure we're going to have, off the back of this, we'll have a series of conversations about Nettles and explore this further because, as you say, some of the others might, or somebody that hasn't even started thinking about this yet will join the conversation. Yeah, I mean, but I'm just very hopeful that people want stuff and that is, well, just to respond to what you said about value, I think the issue that we've got, like valuing truth, we've touched on that, haven't we? Like the impetus behind the conservation movement is valuing biodiversity, but to me, it's at the expense of valuing human culture. There's almost like a sneering and anti civilization, anti-human basically perspective when people get really impassioned about species extinction and biodiversity. They end up basically despising their own species, and so we then value biodiversity at the expense of valuing our own selves. And I think that kind of self-loathing is a road to nowhere. We're not going to solve things. So to me, the thing is back to what the exact point you were just making about valuing the products of culture and the things that we depend on, because the mass production has basically led to a complete eroding of any sense of value. It's the same with food, isn't it? You could have been talking about food. People have made the same point about food, haven't they, over and over again? Like, part of the reason, we're not going organic and we're not going this and that is because people just expect to have all this disposable income, and they don't expect to be paying, 40% or 60% of their weekly income on food. But in the past, that fibre would have been so valued because it was so hard to come by. That food would have been so valued, and people just wouldn't expect to have, 250 quid or 500 quid to just squander on, a visit at some expensive hotel or whatever it is people do with their money these days. Yeah, I'm off on another rant, but like the thing, I just think the thing about values, one of the main things I think we have in our hands, if we're going to, successfully strive for a better future that doesn't just wipe everything out and cause everything go to hell, is we have to sort out values, like what really does matter, what really is important. I mean, it's like, let me I like to make a few little quotes, but one of my favorite songs is All Along the Watchtower by Bob Dylan, and he says, businessmen drink my wine and ploughmen dig my earth, and none of them along the line know what any of it is worth. And that's the thing we're dealing with, I think.
Well, a lot of people got disconnected from the natural environment, and that is maybe the cultural problem, that people don't have any sense of it. So that is a cultural problem, and that's when we become a problem, when we don't work with it, when we don't understand it, when we don't respect it. So that is where we are today, and probably one of the main reasons why we're in such a mess. I don't know.
And I think that's it. We're just not touching the ground. So no wonder we don't know it, and no wonder we don't value it.
Mm. I must tell you about one of my granddaughters.
Yeah.
Who's 5. This year, she made an announcement. She said that she was Nettle girl. She spends a lot of time fiddling with nettle fibre, and recently she's been fiddling with willow. So as soon as she gets a bit of willow in her hand, she starts twisting it into a shape, little bracelets and reeds and things. And there's presents to people. Whoever's there gets a willow present. But anyway, I just thought you'd like to know that there is hope. There's someone out there who's going to carry the flag.
Yeah, maybe she's going to sort it out. Maybe she's the one that's going to work out how we can.
Oh, she is actually. She is. She's already said what she's going to be doing. Yes, but she is 5.
But yes, but she's coming. She's on her way.
Yes.
That's fantastic. Well, I think we better wrap this up because we've got, as I speak, we've got 1 hour and 43 minutes.
Oh dear.
Well, quite frankly, I can't see that we're going to be able to edit much out of this because it's been a wonderful conversation. So I think we probably better stop chatting for now because I'm not sure we can expect people to listen to more than 1 hour and 43. But nearly 1 hour and 44, nearly there. Okay. It's such a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're really welcome. So you're the first on the scene. You're the one that's broken this conversation open on Nettles.
Well,
I
have
think
been around.
We're going to have.
I've been around in Nettles for a long time, so maybe that's okay.
You're an elder of Nettles. Yeah, wonderful.
It's lovely speaking to you.
So thanks for listening to this week's Worldwide podcast. As ever, if you look on the forager.org.uk/podcast page, you'll find the actual page for this particular episode, and there'll be links below that, which are mentioned in the podcast, and just for you to explore Gillian's work and also the work that other people are doing around nettle fibre. And also, we'd very much appreciate it if you go on to any of the iTunes or Apple podcast pages and leave a review. It'll perhaps encourage more people to come and listen. But probably more importantly than that, if you could mention the podcast to people you know and just enable other people to tap into this material, we'd love there to be more people listening. And do get in touch and let us know where you are and what you're getting from these podcasts. And even if you have suggestions for people we should be talking to, that would be great. Okay, that's it for this week's Worldwide Podcast.